Bohemond's defeat and capture by Malik Ghazi of the Danishmend, though alarming at the time, ended up benefiting the Frankish leaders in some ways. Antioch needed a new regent, and Tancred was the clear choice to replace his uncle for king. Baldwin, this was an opportunity to remove his most troublesome vassal from Palestine. Tancred, meanwhile, was eager to leave an unstable and uncomfortable situation behind and take on a more promising and independent role. He departed from Palestine in March 1101, on the condition that if Bohemond returned from captivity within 3 years and Antioch no longer required him, he would regain his fief of Galilee. As a result, both Baldwin and Tancred had reasons to hope that Bohemond would remain in captivity for a while. No negotiations were made for his release. As regent, Tancred acted properly. He never claimed the title of Prince of Antioch. Even though he minted coins, the inscription written in poor Greek referred to him only as the servant of God. At other times he called himself the Grand Emir. It's likely that public opinion in Antioch would have prevented him from reaching beyond these modest titles. The Norman followers still viewed Bohemond as their rightful leader. Bohemond also had a loyal ally in Bernard of Valence, the Latin patriarch he had appointed just before his capture, replacing the Greek Patriarch John the Oxite. Tancred continued Bohemond's policies. Domestically, he worked to strengthen Antioch's administration and further Latinize the church. Abroad, he sought to increase his wealth at the expense of both the Byzantines and the surrounding Muslim rulers. However, his ambitions were more limited and local than those of his uncle. His main concern was defending against a possible Byzantine attack. The failed Crusades of 1101 actually worked in his favor, as the resurgence of the Anatolian Turks made it impossible for the Byzantine emperor to send troops deep into the southeast for some time. Tancred believed that the best defense was a strong offense. So, likely soon after hearing of the battle at Merciven in the summer of 1101, he sent forces into Cilicia and reclaimed Mamistra, Adana, and Tarsus, which the Byzantines had taken back 3 years earlier. The Byzantine troops in the region were too weak to resist him. When William of Aquitaine and Hugh of Vermandois arrived in Tarsus at the end of September, fleeing from battle, they found the city under the control of Tancred's lieutenant, Bernard the Stranger. Tancred next set his sights on Latakia, a Byzantine port long desired by the Normans. Capturing it would be more difficult, as it was defended not only by a Byzantine garrison but also by troops from Raymond of Toulouse and a contingent of the Byzantine navy. Before launching an attack, Tancred began negotiating for support from Genoese ships. While waiting, he took control of the surrounding countryside and tried to seize the nearby city of Jabala to the south. Bohemond had previously sent a small, unsuccessful force to Jabala in the summer of 1100, during which his constable was captured. Tancred's own attempt in the summer of 1101 also failed. However, it pressured Ibn Soleha, the Qadi of Jabala, into handing the city over to the Atabeg of Damascus. Ibn Soleha then retired to Damascus to live out his later years peacefully. The Atabeg, Tatakan, appointed his son Buri as governor, but Buri proved unpopular. After only a few months, the people of Jabala ousted him and placed themselves under the protection of the Banu Amor of Tripoli. Following this, Tancred withdrew his forces from the area. Tancred's capture of Raymond of Toulouse gave him the leverage to resume his plans for Latakia. He had imprisoned Raymond in Antioch, but this caused outrage among the Crusader leadership, including Patriarch Bernard. Under their pressure, Tancred agreed to release Raymond on the condition that he swore never again to meddle in northern Syrian affairs. After taking the oath, Raymond headed south to launch an attack on Tortosa. Staying true to his promise, he ordered his troops and his wife, the Countess, to evacuate Latakia as they passed by, leaving the Byzantine garrison without provincial support. With the port weakened, Tancred advanced on Latakia in early spring of 1102. However, the city's defenses were strong, the garrison resisted fiercely, and the Byzantine navy kept them well supplied. The siege dragged on for nearly a year. But in early 1103, with the help of Genoese ships now hired to disrupt communication between Latakia and Cyprus, Tancred managed to trick part of the garrison into leaving the city walls. He ambushed them and took them prisoner, with their forces compromised. The city surrendered to him shortly afterward. Emperor Alexius was far from pleased by these developments. He was already upset about the expulsion of the Greek Patriarch of Antioch, John the Oxite, and by reports that Greek clergy were being systematically replaced by Latins in the higher ranks of the church. In early 1102, he received a letter from King Baldwin, who had heard rumors that Byzantine reluctance to cooperate had contributed to the failure of the Crusades of 1101. In his letter, Baldwin urged the emperor to fully support any future crusade. The letter was delivered by a bishop named Manasses, who had traveled to Palestine with Eckhard in 1101 and was now returning from Jerusalem. Baldwin's message was respectful and accompanied by gifts, which led Alexius to believe he could speak openly with the bishop and share his frustrations. However, he misjudged Manasses. The bishop was more loyal to Latin interests than to Christian unity and had little sympathy for the Greeks. At Alexius's request, Manasses continued on to Italy and relayed their conversation to the Pope, but the way he reported it enraged the papacy. Had Pope Urban II still been alive, the situation might have been salvaged. Urban had a broad vision and had no desire to provoke conflict with the Eastern Church. Unfortunately, his successor, Paschal II, was narrow-minded and easily swayed. He quickly adopted the common Frankish belief that the Byzantine emperor was an enemy. As a result, Alexius received no support or resolution to his concerns. Meanwhile, Tancred tried to exert influence over the Kingdom of Jerusalem. In 1101, King Baldwin had exiled Patriarch Daimbert. Tancred promptly welcomed Daimbert to Antioch and allowed him to use the Church of St. George. A few months later, when Baldwin suffered defeat at the hands of the Saracens at Ramla and called on the northern princes for help, Tancred refused to assist unless Daimbert was reinstated as Patriarch in Jerusalem. Baldwin agreed to the condition, which enhanced Tancred's reputation for a time. However, Daimbert was soon condemned by a church council and exiled again. Tancred once more gave him refuge, but this time he chose not to continue advocating for his reinstatement. Tancred's actions did not always sit well with his neighbor, Baldwin of Labourg, who ruled Edessa. Baldwin was the son of Count Hugh I of Rethel and related to the House of Boulogne. As a younger son, he had traveled east with his cousins, Godfrey of Lorraine and King Baldwin. When Baldwin I established himself in Edessa, Baldwin of Labourg remained behind with Bohemond, acting as a go-between for the two princes. After Bohemond was captured, he briefly took control of Antioch until Baldwin of Edessa was called to Jerusalem. At that point, Baldwin of Labourg was granted Edessa as a fief by his cousin, to rule independently but still under the authority of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. His position was far from easy. Edessa lacked natural borders and was constantly vulnerable to attacks. He could only maintain control by stationing troops in key cities and fortresses, something that required trustworthy men. Lacking many Frankish followers, he worked to build strong relationships with the local Christian population. One of his first actions as count was to marry Morphia, a young Armenian noblewoman and daughter of the influential Gabriel of Melitene, who was ethnically Armenian but followed the Orthodox Church. Baldwin also courted the support of the Armenians from the separate Gregorian Church. Their renowned historian, Matthew of Edessa, praised Baldwin for his kindness and personal integrity, though he criticized his ambition and greed. Baldwin especially valued the Armenians for their military usefulness, but he also showed goodwill toward his Syrian Jacobite subjects and even helped resolve a division within their church. The main criticism leveled against him was his hunger for money. Constantly short on funds, he found ways to raise money wherever possible. However, unlike Baldwin I, his methods were seen as more measured and less forceful. His knights were particularly amused when he managed to collect 30,000 bezants from his father-in-law Gabriel through a clever trick. Baldwin claimed he owed this amount to his men and had sworn that if he couldn't pay, he would shave off his beard. Among Armenians, as with Greeks, a beard was considered essential to a man's dignity, and the clean-shaven Crusaders were already viewed with some discomfort. Not wanting his prestige damaged by a beardless son-in-law, Gabriel quickly paid. The sum Baldwin's soldiers played along, insisting their lord had indeed made the oath, prompting Gabriel to act. In return, he made Baldwin swear never again to stake his beard as collateral. Early in his rule, Baldwin II had to defend his territory against an attack from the Ordokids of Mardin. Their leader, Emir Sokman, launched an assault on Saruj, a Muslim town that had previously been captured by Baldwin I and placed under the control of Fulcher of Chartres. Baldwin II rushed to Fulcher's aid, but in the battle that followed, he was defeated and Fulcher was killed. The town fell to the Muslims, although the citadel continued to resist under the leadership of Benedict, the Latin archbishop. Of Edessa, Baldwin retreated to Antioch to recruit more troops and rebuild his army. When he returned, he had greater success. Sokman was expelled from Saruj with significant losses. Baldwin then ordered the execution of local inhabitants who had cooperated with the Ordokids, and many prisoners were captured. The ransom paid for their release brought a welcome boost to Baldwin's treasury. Not long after, Baldwin gained a capable ally in his cousin, Jocelyn of Courtenay. Jocelyn, whose mother was Baldwin's aunt, was the younger son of the Lord of Courtenay and came to the east with little wealth, likely alongside the Count of Nevers, his close neighbor. Upon his arrival, Baldwin granted him control over all the lands in the county west of the Euphrates, with Turbessel as his base. Jocelyn proved to be a brave and valuable companion, though questions would later arise about his loyalty. As time went on, Baldwin began to grow wary of Tancred's ambitions and became increasingly inclined to see Bohemond restored to Antioch. With Patriarch Bernard, he began negotiating with the Danishmend emir to arrange Bohemond's release. Tancred had no part in these talks. The emir had already been offered a massive ransom of 260,000 bezants by Emperor Alexius in exchange for Bohemond. He was prepared to accept the deal until the Seljuk Sultan, Kilij Arslan, who held nominal authority over the Anatolian Turks, learned of it. Kilij Arslan demanded half of the ransom for himself. This sparked a dispute between the two Turkish rulers, delaying any agreement with the emperor. However, their quarrel had the advantage of breaking their alliance. While in captivity, Bohemond was aware of these developments. Still charming and charismatic, he attracted the attention of the emir's household, especially its women. Possibly. With their help, he convinced the emir that a private agreement with the Frankish leaders in Syria and the promise of their alliance would be more beneficial than a deal with the emperor, especially one that the Seljuks were trying to interfere with. The emir eventually agreed to release Bohemond for a payment of 100,000 bezants. While negotiations for Bohemond's release were still underway, the Danishmend army launched an attack on Melitene. Gabriel, the city's ruler and Baldwin's father-in-law, must have appealed to Baldwin for help, but Baldwin chose not to intervene, likely because he didn't want to antagonize the Danishmend emir at such a delicate moment. Gabriel was unpopular among his subjects, particularly the Syrians, who resented him for his Orthodox faith and had never forgiven him for once executing one of their bishops for treason. As a result, when the Danishmends attacked, both Gabriel and his capital were captured. One of his castles held out, but when Gabriel was ordered by his captors to command its surrender and the garrison refused, he was executed in front of its walls. A few months later, in the spring of 1103, Bohemond was finally released to the Franks at Melitene. His ransom had been raised by Baldwin and Patriarch Bernard, with the assistance of the Armenian prince Co-Vasil and Bohemond's family in Italy. Tancred did not contribute to the payment. Bohemond returned immediately to Antioch, where he was restored to power. Publicly, he expressed gratitude to Tancred for managing the principality during his absence. Privately, however, there was tension between the two. Tancred was reluctant to surrender territories he had conquered while serving as regent. In the end, public pressure forced Tancred to yield, and he was granted a small fief within the principality as compensation. Although he was entitled to reclaim Galilee from Baldwin I, he chose not to pursue it, believing it wasn't worth the effort. Bohemond's return was followed by a broad offensive by the Franks. In the summer of 1103, Bohemond and Jocelyn, of Courtenay launched a raid into the territory around Aleppo. They captured the town of Muslimi just north of the city and extracted a large tribute from the local Muslim population. The money was used to repay the debts Baldwin and the Patriarch had incurred to secure Bohemond's ransom. After this, the Franks turned their attention to the Byzantines. Emperor Alexius had written to Bohemond demanding the return of the Cilician cities. He also dispatched his general Beutamites to reclaim them. Beutamites' forces proved unreliable. He entered Cilicia in the autumn of 1103 but soon realized the task was beyond him. Learning that the Franks were planning a northward expansion toward Marescia city held by the Armenian Thetal on behalf of the Emperor, Beutamites rushed to defend it. His intervention likely saved Thetal temporarily, but he was soon recalled to Constantinople. In early spring, Bohemond and Jocelyn advanced on Marescia. Thetal was powerless to resist. The Byzantine army was too far away, and the Danishmend Turks had grown friendly with the Franks. Thetal surrendered the city to Jocelyn, who allowed him to withdraw to Constantinople. Meanwhile, Bohemond captured Albistan, located to the north of Marescia. The Franks now felt safe from any immediate threat coming from Anatolia. With that security, they turned their focus eastward, targeting the Muslim powers of Syria. In March 1104, Bohemond launched another campaign into the territory of Ridwan of Aleppo and captured the town of Basarfat, which lay along the road between Antioch and Aleppo. However, his assault on Kafalata, further to the south, failed due to strong resistance from the local Banu Ulaim tribe. Meanwhile, Jocelyn of Courtenay disrupted communications between Aleppo and the Euphrates, further isolating the city. If the Franks were to effectively sever the ties between the Muslims of Syria and those of Iraq and Persia, they would need to seize control of the powerful fortress of Harran. Positioned between Edessa and the Euphrates in the northern Jezereh, Harran was a strategic stronghold. Controlling it would open the way for a possible expedition toward Mosul and into the heart of Mesopotamia. By spring of 1104, the moment seemed favorable. In the previous year, the Eastern Muslim world had been caught in a civil war between the Seljuk Sultan Barkiarak and his brother Muhammad. Although peace was reached in January 1104, the arrangement was fragile. Barkiarak kept control of Baghdad and western Iran, while their brother Sanyar retained Khorasan and eastern Iran. Muhammad took charge of northern Iraq, the Jezereh region, and claimed suzerainty over Diyarbakir and all of Syria. But none of the brothers trusted the others, and each continued plotting for dominance, seeking allies among various Turkish and Arab princes. In the Jezereh itself, the power vacuum created by the death of Kerboga, the former Atabeg of Mosul, who had been defeated by the Franks at Antioch in 1102, led to another civil war. The Ottoman Prince Sokman of Mardin had tried but failed to secure the succession for his chosen candidate, losing out to Jekarmish, the new Atabeg installed by Sultan Muhammad. At Harran, meanwhile, the situation was chaotic. The fortress had been under the control of a Turkish general named Karaja, once a slave soldier in the service of Malik Shah, but Karaja's cruel treatment of the population sparked a revolt, and the locals turned the city over to a man named Muhammad of Isfahan. However, Muhammad was later murdered by a former page of Karaja's named Jawali, with whom he had grown too close. Jawali's grip on power remained unstable, and his position was further undermined by frequent raids from the Franks of Edessa. These raids devastated the countryside and disrupted trade, making it increasingly clear that the Franks were preparing for a much larger offensive. The situation soon grew serious enough to unite two former enemies, alarmed by the growing threat of the Franks. Sokman of Mardin and Jekarmish of Mosul put aside their rivalry and decided to strike first. In early May 1104, they marched together on Edessa, Sokman leading a sizable force of Turkoman-like cavalry, and Jekarmish commanding a somewhat smaller army made up of Seljuk Turks, Kurds, and Arabs. Baldwin II learned that the two forces were gathering at Ras al-Ain, about 70 miles from Edessa. He immediately called for reinforcements from Jocelyn and Bohemond, proposing that instead of waiting for an attack, they launch their own offensive against Harran. Leaving a small garrison to guard Edessa, Baldwin headed toward Harran with a small band of knights and Armenian infantry. The Archbishop of Edessa, Benedict, accompanied him. Near Harran, Baldwin was joined by Jocelyn and his troops, as well as the Antiochian army under Bohemond, Tancred, Patriarch Bernard, and Daimbert, the former Patriarch of Jerusalem. Altogether, the Frankish force numbered close to 3,000 knights, and perhaps 3 times as many infantry, essentially the entire military strength of northern Syria's Frankish states, aside from fortress garrisons. The Franks gathered before Harran while the Muslim princes were still far to the northeast, advancing on Edessa. Had the Franks launched an immediate assault, Harran would likely have fallen, but they hoped to preserve the city's defenses for their own future use and assumed the garrison might surrender under pressure. This seemed possible. The defenders were weak and quickly opened negotiations, but then disaster struck. Baldwin and Bohemond got into a dispute over which of them should have the honor of raising their banner first over the city walls. The delay this caused proved fatal. Before the matter was resolved, the Turkish army shifted direction, swooped south, and descended upon the unsuspecting Franks. The battle took place near the river Balik, not far from the ancient battlefield of Carrhae, where Roman legions under Crassus had once been crushed by the Parthians. The Franks' plan was for the Edessan troops on the left to engage the enemy while the Antiochian forces, hidden behind a nearby hill to the right, would wait to strike at the critical moment. Unbeknownst to them, the Muslims had devised a similar tactic. A portion of the Muslim army attacked Baldwin's forces, then pretended to retreat. The Edessans, thinking they had won easily, gave chase. In doing so, they lost contact with the Antiochian forces and crossed the river right into an ambush set by the main body of the Muslim army. Many were killed outright. The rest tried to flee. Bohemond, meanwhile, had defeated the small detachment opposing him and was preparing to move in. But instead of allies, he saw a flood of panicked Edessan soldiers retreating and being cut down as they tried to cross the river. Realizing the battle was lost, he withdrew quickly, managing to rescue only a handful of survivors. As the retreating troops passed near Harran's walls, the city's garrison joined the chaos, attacking both Muslims and Franks alike in the confusion. The Antiochian army managed to escape with minimal losses, but the forces of Edessa were nearly wiped out, either killed or taken prisoner. The situation was so terrifying that Patriarch Bernard, while fleeing, cut off his horse's tail out of fear that a Turk might grab hold of it to catch him, though. By that time, no enemy was even close. One of the first to be captured after the battle was Archbishop Benedict. However, whether due to the leniency of his jailer, a Christian who had converted to Islam, or because of a counterattack by Antiochian forces, he was quickly rescued. Baldwin and Jocelyn fled together on horseback, but they were eventually overtaken in a riverbed and taken as prisoners to Sokman's camp. Fearing that the Turks would now turn their attention to Edessa, Bohemond and Tancred rushed there to prepare its defenses. Once again, a colleague's misfortune played to Tancred's benefit. The remaining knights in Edessa, led by the archbishop, urged Tancred to take up the regency until Baldwin could be freed. Tancred gladly accepted. Just as Baldwin had once been relieved to send Tancred north, Bohemond was now similarly pleased to see him depart. Tancred remained in Edessa with the battered remnants of its army and the limited forces Bohemond could spare, while Bohemond returned to Antioch to protect it from neighboring powers that were now looking to exploit the Frankish setback. The Battle of Harran, in many ways, marked the closing act of the events set in motion by the failed Crusades of 1101. Together, these defeats shattered the myth of Frankish invincibility. The disasters of 1101 had already ensured that northern Syria would not receive vital reinforcements from the west, reinforcements that were crucial for securing Frankish control. Now the defeat at Harran sealed the fate of the county of Edessa and ensured that Aleppo would remain out of Frankish hands. The Franks had aimed to drive a wedge between the 3 great Muslim centers, Anatolia, Iraq, and Syria, but that wedge was never securely fixed. And it wasn't just the Muslims who gained from the Franks' failure. In Constantinople, the Byzantine emperor had been watching events unfold with growing resentment, and he took some satisfaction in seeing the Franks humbled. The immediate aftermath of the Frankish defeat at Harran was not as catastrophic as might have been expected. The alliance between Soghman and Jeckermish quickly fell apart after their victory. Soghman's Turkoman troops had claimed most of the prisoners and loot, which sparked jealousy on Jeckermish's side. In retaliation, Jeckermish's Seljuk forces attacked Soghman's camp and seized Baldwin for themselves. The Turkomans were outraged, but Soghman kept his composure and prevented them from retaliating. Accepting the loss of such a valuable prisoner, he turned his attention elsewhere. After capturing a few small Christian border forts, using a simple trick disguising his men in clothing taken from their fallen Frankish enemies, he withdrew to Mardin and exited the conflict entirely. Jeckermish, however, continued the fight. First, to protect himself against any possible response from Soghman, he captured several Frankish strongholds in the Shabaktan region east of Edessa. Then he advanced toward the city itself. The earlier hesitation of the Franks had allowed Harran to be saved for the Muslims. Now, the delay on the Muslim side gave Edessa a chance to survive. Tancred had enough time to strengthen the city's defenses and managed to hold off Jeckermish's initial assault, thanks in large part to the courage and loyalty of the local Armenian population. Despite this, the pressure on Edessa was intense, and Tancred sent an urgent plea for help to Bohemond. Though Bohemond was dealing with problems of his own, he recognized the importance of Edessa and marched quickly to support his nephew. Poor road conditions slowed his advance, and Tancred, fearing the worst, ordered a pre-dawn sortie. Under cover of darkness, his troops surprised the overconfident Turks in their sleep. Their attack was so effective that when Bohemond's forces finally arrived, the victory was complete. Jeckermish fled in panic, abandoning his camp and its treasures. The disaster at Harran had been avenged, and Edessa was saved. Among the prisoners taken by Tancred was a high-ranking Seljuk princess from Jeckermish's household. Her capture was such a blow that Jeckermish immediately offered a choice: pay a ransom of 15,000 bezants or exchange her for Count Baldwin. Word of this proposal reached Jerusalem, and King Baldwin quickly wrote to Bohemond, urging him to accept the exchange and secure his cousin's release. But Bohemond and Tancred had little interest in giving up a profitable ransom. Besides, Baldwin's return would mean Tancred would lose his position and likely be sent back to Antioch under Bohemond's authority. Their response was that appearing too eager might drive Jeckermish to increase the price. Publicly, they claimed they were negotiating carefully. Privately, they arranged to accept the money instead of the exchange. Baldwin remained in captivity. After enriching themselves by allowing their comrade Baldwin to remain in captivity, Bohemond and Tancred turned their attention to the threats now surrounding them. Jeckermish made no further attempts to attack Edessa, giving Tancred the opportunity to strengthen the city's defenses. Bohemond, however, faced an immediate challenge as Ridwan of Aleppo launched an invasion into the eastern parts of his principality. In June, the Armenian residents of Arta handed their town over to Ridwan's forces, eager to escape what they saw as oppressive Antiochian rule. Other frontier towns, Merit, Mizran, and Sarmen, soon followed, and the small Frankish garrisons in places like Merit and Neumann, Albara, and Kafardab, now cut off, withdrew back to Antioch. Meanwhile, Ridwan's forces raided as far as the Iron Bridge. In the north, Bohemond's garrison at Albistan managed to hold out only by arresting prominent Armenians who were suspected of conspiring with the Turks. Bohemond's entire principality could have been at serious risk if not for an unexpected turn of events. Dukak of Damascus died in late June 1104, and Ridwan's focus shifted to the resulting power struggle between Dukak's sons, Buri and Utash, ****, Bohemond's inability to respond effectively to Ridwan's invasion was largely due to his preoccupation with matters involving the Byzantine Empire. Emperor Alexius had by now cultivated friendly relations with the southern Crusader states. He remained close with Raymond of Toulouse and had earned King Baldwin's goodwill by personally funding the ransoms of many high-ranking Franks held prisoner in Egypt. This generosity was politically astute. It stood in sharp contrast to the way Bohemond and Tancred had handled Baldwin of Edessa's captivity, and served as a reminder to the Franks that the emperor still carried significant influence, even among the Fatimids. So, when Alexius turned his attention toward Antioch, Bohemond received no support from his fellow Crusader leaders. The emperor had already fortified Corycus and Seleucia on the Cilician coast to block further Antiochene expansion into western Cilicia. Then, in the summer of 1104, a Byzantine army under General Monastras easily reoccupied the eastern Cilician cities of Tarsus, Adana, and Mamistra. At the same time, a Byzantine fleet under Admiral Canicozenus, originally sent to pursue Genoese raiders near Cyprus, took advantage of Bohemond's weakened position and sailed on to Latakia, where it captured the harbor and lower city. Bohemond rushed to Latakia with whatever troops he could gather, reinforcing the garrison in the citadel and replacing its commander, whom he did not trust. However, lacking any naval power of his own, he made no attempt to drive the Byzantines out of their newly gained foothold. By the autumn of 1104, Bohemond found himself in a desperate situation. In September, he held a council in Antioch with his vassals and summoned Tancred to attend. There, he spoke openly about the grave threats facing the principality. The only solution, he said, was to obtain reinforcements from Europe, and he would go himself to secure them. Tancred offered to take on the mission, but Bohemond told him that he lacked the necessary influence in the west. Tancred would have to stay behind as regent of Antioch. Preparations were made for Bohemond's departure. Late in the autumn, he sailed from St. Simeon, taking with him all the treasure he could gather: gold, silver, jewels, fine fabrics, and copies of the Gesta Francorum, a history of the First Crusade written from the Norman perspective. Into these texts, Bohemond inserted a passage suggesting that the Byzantine emperor had promised him the lordship of Antioch. Tancred assumed control of the government of Antioch and swore an oath that he would return Edessa to Baldwin as soon as Baldwin was released from captivity. Since Tancred couldn't effectively govern Edessa from Antioch, he appointed his cousin and brother-in-law, Richard of Salerno, to act as his deputy on the far side of the Euphrates. Bohemond reached his own lands in Apulia early the next year. He remained there until the following September, attending to personal matters that required his presence after 9 years away, and organizing Norman contingents to join the Crusaders in the east. Then he traveled to Rome, where he met with Pope Paschal II. Bohemond painted Emperor Alexius as the greatest threat to the Latin cause in the east. The Pope, already influenced by Bishop Manassas's earlier reports, was quick to agree. Bohemond continued into France, now joined by the papal legate Bruno, who had been tasked with preaching a holy war not against Muslims but against the Byzantine Empire. This marked a turning point in crusading history. The Norman strategy to undermine and break the Eastern Empire became official policy. The broader goals of Christendom were cast aside in favor of the ambitions of Frankish adventurers. Although Pope Paschal would later come to regret his decision, the damage was done. The long-standing resentment many Western knights and lay people held toward the Byzantines, fueled by cultural misunderstandings, suspicion, and envy, was now backed by church authority. From this point forward, even if the Pope later tried to soften his position, the Crusaders felt justified in any hostile action against Byzantium. The Byzantines, for their part, saw their worst fears come true. What had been presented as a mission to defend Christendom now looked to them like little more than Western imperialism in religious disguise. This tragic alliance between Bohemond and Pope Paschal did more to solidify the schism between the Eastern Orthodox and Roman Catholic churches than any theological dispute or prior controversy, including the famous clash between Cardinal Humbert and Patriarch Michael Cerularius. Bohemond was warmly received in France. He spent time at the court of King Philip, who granted him permission to recruit soldiers throughout the kingdom. He also gained the enthusiastic support of Adela, Countess of Blois, a devoted supporter of the Crusades. Adela introduced him to her brother Henry I of England, whom Bohemond met in Normandy at Easter in 1106. Henry promised to support his efforts. Attila also helped arrange an influential marriage between Bohemond and King Philip's daughter, Constance, the former, Countess of Champagne. The wedding took place in the late spring of 1106. At the same time, King Philip agreed to offer his younger daughter, Cecilia, born from his affair with Bertrada of Montfort, as a bride for Tancred, although Constance never traveled to the east and spent her married life and widowhood in Italy. Cecilia sailed to Antioch later that year. These royal marriages significantly boosted the standing of the Norman princes. Bohemond remained in France until late 1106 before returning to Apulia. There, he began organizing his new crusade, this time openly directed against the Byzantine Empire. Reassured by reports that Antioch was secure under Tancred's leadership, he felt no urgency. On October 9, 1107, his army landed on the Epirote coast at Avlona. 4 days later, he arrived at the great fortress of Dyrrhachium, the strategic gateway to the Balkans that the Normans had long desired and briefly held. Some 25 years earlier, but Emperor Alexius had used the time well and was fully prepared. To protect Dyrrhachium, he was even willing to compromise elsewhere, making peace with the Seljuk Sultan Kelij Arslan and hiring mercenaries from him. Bohemond found the fortress too well defended for a direct assault and settled into a siege. However, just as in his earlier campaigns against Byzantium, his lack of naval power proved fatal. The Byzantine fleet quickly severed his supply lines to Italy and blockaded the coast. Early the following spring, the main Byzantine army surrounded his position. As summer wore on, the Norman forces were devastated by dysentery, malaria, and famine. Alexius further demoralized them with psychological tactics, spreading rumors and forging letters to confuse and divide, the leadership methods later praised by his daughter Anna. By September, Bohemond realized he had no hope of victory. He surrendered to the emperor. It was a major triumph for Byzantium. By this point, Bohemond was one of the most celebrated warriors in Christendom. The image of this towering, powerful figure kneeling before Emperor Alexius and accepting his terms stood as a powerful symbol of the empire's enduring strength and prestige, one that no one present would ever forget. Alexius received Bohemond at his camp near the entrance to the Deval River ravines. He greeted him politely but without warmth and quickly presented him with a peace treaty he was expected to sign. Bohemond hesitated, but Nicephorus Bryennius Anacomnana's husband, who was present, persuaded him that he had no real choice. Anacomnena preserved the full text of the treaty in her writings. In it, Bohemond first had to express regret for breaking his earlier oath to the emperor. He then solemnly swore to become the vassal and liegeman of Emperor Alexius and his heir, John, the Porphyrogenitos. All of Bohemond's men were likewise to swear loyalty. To avoid confusion, the treaty used the Latin word for liege, and clearly outlined a vassal's duties. Bohemond was allowed to remain Prince of Antioch, but only under the emperor's authority. His domain would include Antioch, its port of St. Simeon, and lands stretching northeast to Marish, as well as any territory he might conquer from the Muslim rulers of Aleppo and surrounding regions. However, the coastal cities of Cilicia and the area around Latakia were to be returned to direct Byzantine rule. He was also forbidden from interfering with the lands of the Rupenian Armenian princes. An appendix carefully listed the towns included in Bohemond's jurisdiction. Asterisk. While Bohemond would retain civil authority in his territory, the Latin Patriarch of Antioch was to be removed and replaced by a Greek one. The treaty also included a clause requiring Bohemond to enforce its terms even against Tancred or any of his own followers. Should they refuse to comply, the Treaty of Deval reveals the strategy Alexius had adopted toward the Crusaders. He was willing to allow Latin rulers to control frontier regions, even Antioch itself, so long as they acknowledged the emperor's overlordship in the latent feudal tradition, and allowed Byzantium to maintain religious influence through the church. Alexius also believed it was his duty to protect the Christian populations in the east, and even sought to uphold the rights of his often unreliable Armenian vassals. Though it was never enforced, the treaty marked the end of Bohemond's ambitions. Broken and disgraced, he never returned to the east. He He withdrew to his lands in Apulia, where he died in 1111, no longer a heroic crusader, but a fading Italian noble. He left behind 2 infant sons from his French marriage as heirs to his claims on Antioch. Bohemond had been a courageous soldier, a daring and clever commander, and the most dazzling figure of the First Crusade. But in the end, it was his boundless and reckless ambition that brought about his downfall. The time had not yet come for the Crusaders to overthrow the Eastern Empire, the last stronghold of Christendom in the East. Alexius understood clearly that the Treaty of Duvall would only be effective if Tancred agreed to it, but Tancred had no intention of doing so. He was glad to see his uncle Bohemond removed from Eastern politics and had no desire to become a vassal of the emperor. Though his ambitions were not as vast as Bohemond's, Tancred aimed to build a strong, independent principality of his own. His position, however, was difficult. Bohemond had left him with few soldiers and no money. Still, Tancred chose to act boldly. He raised funds through a forced loan from the wealthy merchants of Antioch, which allowed him to hire local mercenaries. He also called in all available knights and cavalry from Edessa, Turbessel, and the surrounding Antiochian territories. In the spring of 1105, Tancred launched an offensive to retake Arta Ridwen of Aleppo, who had been preparing to aid the Banu Amr in their conflict with the Franks further south, redirected his forces to confront Tancred. The 2 armies clashed. On April 20th, at the village of Tizen near Arta, a barren plain scattered with boulders, concerned by the size of the Turkish army, Tancred proposed negotiations, and Ridwan was willing to talk until his cavalry commander, Sabawa, convinced him to attack immediately. The rocky terrain hampered the Turks' typical tactics. Their initial cavalry charge was repelled by the Franks, and when they tried to retreat to regroup, they couldn't reform properly. Meanwhile, their infantry was slaughtered by the Frankish knights. The failed maneuver threw the Turkish forces into chaos. Ridwan and his personal guard fled back to Aleppo, followed by most of his cavalry. The rest of the army, especially the foot soldiers, were killed on the field. Tancred's victory allowed him to reclaim all the territory lost the previous year. The Seljuk garrison abandoned Arta, and Tancred's troops chased the fleeing soldiers to the gates of Aleppo, plundering the terrified civilians as they ran. Forced into submission, Ridwan sued for peace. He agreed to cede all his lands in the Orontes Valley and pay Tancred a regular tribute. By the end of 1105, Tancred had re-established his control as far south as Albara and Merid and Dashen and in February 1106, the emir of Apamea, Caliph Ibn Mulaib, who had not been unfriendly toward the Franks, was assassinated by extremists from Aleppo. After the murder, the killers quarreled with their key ally inside the city, a man named Abul Fath, who had assumed control. Abul Fath then asked Ridwan of Aleppo for assistance. Meanwhile, Tancred, having been invited by the local Armenians, saw an opportunity to intervene and march south to besiege Apamea. However, Abul Fath managed to restore order in the city, and the emirs of Shazar and Hama promised to send help. Tancred, realizing the situation was not in his favor, withdrew after 3 weeks, claiming that he needed to relieve the garrison at Latakia, which had been blockaded by the Byzantines for 18 months and was close to starvation. He resupplied the city and returned to Antioch. A few months later, one of Caliph's sons, Musba ibn Mulabhu, had escaped the fate of his father, arrived in Antioch with about 100 followers. He convinced Tancred to launch another attack on Apamea. This time, with Musba's help, Tancred laid siege again, surrounding the city with a trench to prevent anyone from entering or escaping. This time, none of the nearby emirs came to aid Abul Fath after a few weeks. On the 14th of September 1106, the city surrendered under the condition that the lives of its inhabitants would be spared. Tancred agreed to the terms and entered the city, but then, to satisfy Musba, he executed Abul Fath and 3 of his companions. The other local leaders were taken to Antioch, where they remained until Ridwan paid for their release. Tancred installed a Frankish governor in Apamea and granted Musba a nearby estate. Soon after, the Franks also retook Kufardub, assigning it to a knight named Theophilus. who quickly became notorious among the Muslims of Khazar with his eastern and southern borders now secured. Tancred turned his attention to the enemy he hated most, the Byzantine Empire. In the summer of 1107, as Bohemond prepared to launch an attack on the empire's European territories, Emperor Alexius was forced to withdraw troops from Syria to deal with the greater threat in the Balkans. His commanders, Canticezenus and Monastras, were recalled from Latakia and Cilicia. The emperor handed control of Cilicia over to the Armenian prince of Lampron, Oshin, a noble of distinguished lineage who had once been known for his bravery, but had since grown soft and indolent in the winter of 1108, or early 1109, shortly after. Bohemond's defeat in Epirus, Tancred invaded Cilicia. The key to the region was the fortress of Mamistra, located on the river Jihan. Tancred's army approached both by land, crossing the Amanus Mountains, and by sailing up the river. Oshin did nothing to stop them. Mamistra quickly fell, and over the following months Tancred appears to have regained control of Adana and Tarsus, although western Cilicia remained under Byzantine rule. Oshin withdrew to his estates in the Taurus Mountains. Latakia had already been recaptured. Until then, the Normans had been limited by their lack of naval power. But with the Byzantine fleet now concentrated far away in the Adriatic, Tancred was able to hire a squadron from Pisa. In return, the Pisans demanded a street in Antioch and a district in Latakia, along with a church and a warehouse. Petzius, who had succeeded Canticezenus as the Byzantine commander in Latakia, was powerless to stop them. By the spring of 1108, Latakia was officially incorporated into the Principality of Antioch the following year. Tancred extended his control even further south, seizing Jabala, Bulunias, and the fortress of Markab from the crumbling territories once ruled by the Banu Amor. Thus, while Bohemond was surrendering to the Byzantine emperor and giving up his independence, Tancred was reaching the height of his power and had no intention of obeying the imperial treaty. From the Taurus Mountains to the Jezera and central Syria, he held the dominant position. He ruled Antioch and Edessa formally only as regent, but Bohemond now lived in disgrace in Italy and would never return, while Count Baldwin remained imprisoned by the Turks, with Tancred showing no interest in rescuing him. The emir of Aleppo was practically his vassal, and none of the surrounding Muslim rulers dared challenge him. He had also openly defied the heir of the Byzantine emperors when the emperor sent envoys to Antioch to remind Tancred of Bohemond's treaty commitments. Tancred arrogantly dismissed them. He saw himself, in his own words, as another Ninus, the legendary Assyrian king, an unstoppable giant, yet even arrogance has limits. For all his talents, Tancred was widely mistrusted and disliked. It was not his Muslim enemies, but his fellow Crusaders, who would eventually challenge and restrain his power. Among all the princes who set out on the First Crusade in 1096, Raymond, Count of Toulouse, stood out as the wealthiest and most prestigious. Many had expected him to be named the movement's leader. Yet 5 years later he had become one of the least respected among the Crusaders. Much of his decline stemmed from his own actions. Although he was no more driven by greed or ambition than his fellow leaders, his pride made his flaws more obvious. Raymond's policy of remaining loyal to Emperor Alexius was rooted in genuine honor and long-term strategy. But to his fellow Franks it appeared as cunning betrayal, and it brought him little benefit, as the emperor soon came to see Raymond as an unreliable ally. While his followers admired his devotion to religion, he had little real control over them. During the First Crusade, they had forced him to march on Jerusalem against his better judgment. The failures of 1101 further revealed how unfit he was to command a military campaign. His greatest humiliation came when he was captured by his younger peer Tancred. Although Tancred's betrayal violating the codes of hospitality and honor shocked many, Raymond only secured his release by renouncing all claims to northern Syria. In doing so, he also undermined his prior agreement with the emperor. Raymond was persistent. He had sworn to stay in the east, and he intended to keep that promise. He was determined to carve out a principality of his own. For the Christian holdings in the east to survive, one critical region needed to be brought under control. A chain of Muslim emirates stood between the northern Crusader states of Antioch and Edessa and their southern allies in Jerusalem. The most prominent of these emirates was ruled by the Banu Amr family in Tripoli. Its leader, the Qadi Fakhr al-Mulk Abu Ali, was a peaceful man. Though his military forces were limited, he governed a rich and strategically important region. Through a careful, if sometimes inconsistent, policy of appeasement toward his neighbors, he managed to preserve a fragile independence, ultimately relying on the protection of his capital fortress. Located on the Al-Mina Peninsula, he had often shown goodwill toward the Crusaders. He provided supplies to the First Crusade and did not resist when its leaders laid siege to the city of Arca. He had also supported Baldwin of Boulogne during his difficult journey to claim the throne of Jerusalem. Yet once the Crusader forces moved on, he quietly reoccupied the cities of Tortosa and Mariclia, which they had previously held. As a result, he controlled the entire coastal road stretching from Lataki and Jabala down to the Fatimid-held city of Beirut. The alternative route from northern Syria to Palestine ran along the Orontes Valley. It passed the Munkedite city of Shazar, continued through Hamadan under the rule of Ridwan and reached Homs, governed by Ridwan's stepfather, Jana ad-Dawla. From there, the path split. One branch, which Raymond had taken during the First Crusade, wound through the Bukaya to Tripoli and the coastal regions. The other continued straight on, passing the Damascene-controlled city of Baalbek and heading toward the upper reaches of the Jordan River. Raymond, whose ambitions were anything but modest, envisioned creating a principality that would dominate both the coastal road and the Orontes Valley. With its capital in Homs, the city the Franks referred to as La Chamelle. But his initial goal, likely influenced by the arrival of Genoese ships that might support his efforts, was to seize the coastal city's dot after being released by Tancred in the final days of 1101. Raymond set out from Antioch, accompanied by the surviving nobles from the failed crusades of that year: Stephen of Blois, William of Aquitaine, Welf of Bavaria, and others who were eager to complete their pilgrimage to Jerusalem. At Lataki, Raymond reunited with his wife and troops before advancing toward Tortosa. As he reached the city, a Genoese fleet anchored nearby just offshore. Faced with this combined threat from land and sea, the city's governor offered little resistance. Around mid-February, Raymond entered Tortosa alongside his companions, who agreed without objection that the city should belong to him. They had expected Raymond to continue on to Jerusalem with them. When he refused, they were outraged and, according to one account, spoke sacrilegiously about him. But Raymond had already made up his mind Tortosa would be the foundation of his future dominion. Disappointed, the others left and continued their journey south. Raymond's intentions were no secret, and his movements alarmed the Muslim leaders. Fakhr al-Mulk sent warnings to the emirs of Homs and to Dukak of Damascus. When Raymond approached Tripoli, it became clear his army was small, barely more than 300 men. The Muslim leaders saw this as the perfect opportunity to eliminate him. Dukak quickly dispatched 2,000 cavalry, and Jana ad-Dawla contributed another 2,000. The entire army of the Banu Amr also mobilized. Altogether, the Muslim force outnumbered Raymond's troops 20-1 as they converged on the plains outside the city. The deeds of Raymond were not well documented by the Crusader chroniclers. It is from the Arab historian Ibn al-Athir that we learn of the remarkable battle that followed. Raymond divided his small force strategically. He placed 100 men to face the Damascenes, another 100 to confront the Banu Amr 50 against the troops from Homs, and kept the remaining 50 as his personal guard. The soldiers from Homs launched the first attack, but their assault failed. Suddenly, they panicked, and their fear quickly spread to the troops from Damascus. The forces of Tripoli were having more success. But when Raymond saw the other enemy contingents retreating, he redirected his entire army against the Tripolitans. The sudden and forceful attack overwhelmed them as well, and they broke ranks and fled. Raymond's cavalry pursued the scattered enemy across the battlefield, killing many who could not escape. Ibn al-Athir claimed that as many as 7,000 Muslim soldiers were killed. This victory not only restored Raymond's standing but also secured the survival of his small dominion along the Lebanese coast. After this defeat, Muslim forces no longer dared to attack him directly. However, his army was too small to capture the heavily fortified city of Tripoli, situated on the Al-Mina Peninsula. After collecting a substantial tribute in gold and horses, Raymond returned to Tortosa to prepare for his next campaign over the following months. He consolidated his control in the area surrounding Tortosa. In the spring of 1103 he launched a campaign to take control of the Buqaya, a key step in cutting off Tripoli and expanding his reach toward the Orontes Valley. His surprise assault on the fortress of Tuban at the northeastern end of the valley failed. Undeterred, he began a siege of Khalid al-Hassan, the massive castle that dominated the plain of site briefly occupied by Crusader forces. Back in 1099, the fortress belonged to Jana ad-Dawla of Homs, who could not afford to lose such a vital stronghold. He began organizing a force to break the siege. However, as he left the mosque in Homs after praying for victory, he was assassinated by 3 members of the assassin sect. His sudden death plunged Homs into disarray. Sensing an opportunity, Raymond lifted the siege and marched eastward to exploit the situation. Many believed the murder had been orchestrated by Ridwan of Aleppo, who still held a grudge against Jana for launching an attack on him 3 years earlier during his conflict with the Franks of Antioch. Jana's widow, who was also Redwin's mother, was so alarmed by Raymond's advance that she offered to hand over Homs to her son in Aleppo. However, Jana's advisors rejected this plan and instead called on Dukak of Damascus for help. Dukak quickly came north with his commander, Tadakin, and took control of the city. Placing Tadakin in charge, Raymond realized he lacked the strength to challenge them directly, so he withdrew to the coast. When Raymond returned to Tortosa, he received news that a Genoese fleet of 40 ships had docked at Lataki. He quickly secured their support for an assault on Tripoli. Although the attack was unsuccessful, the Allies continued south and managed to capture the port city of Jebel, known in antiquity as Byblus. As part of their reward, the Genoese were granted 1/3 of the town. Still determined to take Tripoli itself, Raymond established a camp in the city's outskirts during the final months of 1103 and began constructing a massive fortress on a ridge about 3 miles inland. Earlier, in an effort to win favor with the Byzantines, he had attempted to divert Tancred from Lataki. In appreciation, the Byzantines sent him building materials and skilled masons from Cyprus. By the spring of 1104, the fortress was complete and Raymond took up residence. He named it Mount Pilgrim, but the Arabs came to know it as Khalat Sanjal, the Castle of St. Gila.